Each one has prepared a lesson this morning. Pray, Father, that you'll be with them as they present them. Pray, Father, you'll be with each one of us listening and help us to participate in our mind and our thoughts, that we may glean the word and pass it wherever we might go. Pray, Father, you'll be with us now as we go through this lesson. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. I believe we're ready to begin Acts chapter 15 this morning. I appreciate Todd so very much for teaching this class last Sunday morning. You may wish he were teaching it every Sunday morning. And we may arrange that before too long. But we're grateful that you're here. Those of you who are visiting with us, we're so glad that you've come. In this class, we've been studying the life of the Apostle Paul. And right now, the subject under consideration for the last several weeks has been the first missionary journey. The first missionary journey came to an end at the end of chapter 14. And chapter 15 tells about what has commonly come to be called the Jerusalem Council. Now, I've got a little issue with that terminology. I don't really like that terminology. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily biblical. I'm not saying that it's wrong to use that terminology, but I think it does leave the door open for other things that could be ushered in under that same kind of terminology. And it's the word council that gets me. And as we all know, there were in the world of denominationalism, and as denominationalism began to grow and multiply, and it multiplied by dividing, by churches dividing, religious groups splitting up and dividing, and then before long these councils were held. Some of them were fairly well known. Some of them have kind of faded away into history, and we don't know much about anything of them. The Council of the Nicene Council is probably the most recognized council that is referred to in the history of religion after the Bible's history is concluded. In other words, after the story of the Bible reached the end of the volume. But this council, if we're going to call it that, was a gathering, and it truly was a council of sorts. We're going to read the text here in just a minute, and we'll see that it was over as many religious gatherings and discussions and disputes and so forth have been. It was over some false teaching. And it was over the question of whether or not this false teaching that had been brought in by some was really true or was it not true. And part of the reason why this very rare situation of the gathering in the church at Jerusalem of the elders of that congregation and the apostles. One of the reasons that's significant is because of the involvement of the apostles, the inspired preachers and teachers, those who still at that point in time, as they embraced the inspired instructions that God gave them, they were the authority. Under God's authority, they were recipients of God's will, and they were responsible for teaching it to others. And so there would have been no better way to resolve this issue and get to the clear answer than to do, I believe, what was done. given the attitudes of people and the fact that some have and would always doubt and question excuse me, Paul's authority and others. It's obvious from what Paul wrote to several of the churches that there was a strong gathering of people who opposed Paul and did not believe he should be an apostle. So let's read a little bit in this text, and I don't mean to sound like I'm making excuses, but I'm at a little bit of a handicap here because my other Bible that I use in preaching and teaching about half the time had some really significant notes that I'd put in the margin through the years on this particular chapter, and I grabbed the wrong one and ran out of the house this morning. So I'm without those notes. I'll try to remember the gist of what they were. In order to get the full story, let's back up to the closing verses of chapter 14, because chapter 15 begins with the word "but," which gives us an indication, at least that's the way it's rendered in the English Standard Version, that gives us an indication that there is a continuing thought, or as a matter of fact, what is said in chapter 15 is connected to the ending of chapter 14. And so chapter 14 tells of Paul and Barnabas arriving in Antioch from where they had been sent out on that first journey. Verse 27 says, "And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, and they remained no little time with the disciples." They gave their report about the missionary journey. They told the church that had sent them on this journey, they told the church all that they had done, and special emphasis seems to be given to the fact that the gospel has, or a door of faith has been opened to the Gentiles. In the last verse, they remained no little time. And that's archaic language. We would say they stayed with them a long time. They stayed there a long time. They were there with them quite a while. And then chapter 15 makes perfect sense when it says, "But some men came down from Judea." Now, because we know we're talking about the church at Antioch in the close of chapter 14, excuse me, got some kind of critter down there and can't get him to turn loose. He won't go up or down. Because we know that we're talking about the church in Antioch in the end of chapter 14, and chapter 15 begins with a nod in that direction. We know that these men came down from Judea to the church at Antioch. They came to Antioch and were teaching the brothers this: "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." In other words, what they were teaching was, if you want to be saved, you've got to believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and be circumcised. That's not all that unusual to hear. I don't think that's strange at all, given the ideas that some of the Jewish worshipers and followers of the law. See, we're not talking about people who are saying Christ was a fake, he's not real, you don't need to be paying attention to Paul and the rest of these guys. This was a little different segment here. This was a group of people who appear to have been saying that Gentiles can become Christians, but in order for everything to be full, they've got to be circumcised according to the law of Moses. They were mixing together Christianity and Judaism. And so verse 2 says, and after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them. Those who know and study and understand the Greek language tell us that the fact that these two terms are used here to describe the discussion over this subject means that it was not just a little discussion. It was not just something that they casually talked about. This was a great dissension and debate with Paul and Barnabas, and some of the others were appointed. Well, I read that wrong. No small dissension and debate with them. Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. Now, let me ask you something. Was Paul qualified to answer this question? Well, absolutely he was. Did everybody here believe that Paul was qualified to answer this question? Evidently not. So, and some people have said, well, why didn't Paul put his foot down and say, I'm an inspired man. I've been taught by the Lord. I know the answer to this, and you need to pay attention to what I tell you. I think it's a complimentary thing that Paul was willing to go along with the idea of going to Jerusalem and consulting the apostles and elders of the Jerusalem church. There's another element that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the fact that these false teachers came from the church at Jerusalem. For just a minute, turn over to verse 24 of this same chapter. Chapter 15, verse 24. This is while the discussion is going on with the elders there in Jerusalem. In verse 24, one of them said, since we have heard that some persons have gone out from us and troubled you with words unsettling your minds, although we gave them no instructions. In other words, we didn't tell them this was what they needed to teach, but they've come from here. And so that's why we know that this was another reason for this question to be taken back to the Jerusalem church, because that's where it had come from. And so they went up, or they were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. So, being sent on their way by the church. Now, that may mean that the church paid their way. That seems to be the logical thing to me. They were sent on behalf of the church, and the church would have paid their expenses. Some say that means they were given an escort from the church there. And we've already learned that from the previous verse where it says Paul and Barnabas and some others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem. So that question as to exactly what was meant by being sent on their way by the church isn't worth wasting any time trying to discuss, because there's no question that they had come, or that these men going to Jerusalem had come from and were going to ask on behalf of the church there in Antioch. Yes, ma'am.
So, to get it straight in my mind,
Antioch was north of Jerusalem, but
so
it was downhill.
That's where they were at this time with the church in Antioch. Is that right? Paul, Barnabas, okay.
But these men came down from Jerusalem. They were going, these men who brought this false teaching were going north, but they were coming down from the mountain. And that's why it says they were going down. But it was Antioch there that had sent Paul and Barnabas out, that they came back to and gave their report to. And so being sent on their way by the church, they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, describing in detail the conversion of the Gentiles, and brought great joy to all the brothers. Don't miss the fact that they've not only got this job they're going to do, but on the way they're telling everybody that they can the good news about salvation on behalf of the Gentiles. So when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders. That covers everything, doesn't it? Covers everybody. The congregation in general, the church, the apostles, who were the ones who were still there with the church in Jerusalem, and the elders of the church. And they declared all that God had done with them. That's telling them about the missionary journey and the things that they had seen happen, which would necessarily include what? When Paul and Barnabas told the brethren in Jerusalem of the things that God had done with them, what would be one of the things that they were going to tell them about? Conversion of the Gentiles, no doubt. And the next verse says, but some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, it is necessary to circumcise them and to order them to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and the elders were gathered together to consider this matter. And after there had been much debate, is that a little bit disturbing? There was much debate between the apostles and the elders in the church of Jerusalem. It just goes to show that at most any level of a congregation's growth and progress, there is always the possibility of disagreement and even getting caught up in false teaching. It's something we should never, ever let our guard down about. It's something that we should not act like the possibility doesn't exist. We should always be watchful for those who are not teaching the truth. Any kind of false teaching needs to be watched out for. Apparently there were some among the elders, or maybe apostles, who were not 100% on board with the fact that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. In fact, when you consider the rest of the writings of Paul in the New Testament, particularly the book of Galatians and some of the things that he said there, it's obvious that there was this came to be a very popular idea. Now, pretty strong possibility Galatians was written before this time, and I think Todd brought that out. And you know, didn't matter which side of that question you come down on, whether Galatians was written after Acts 15 or before, it doesn't really matter. But the teaching and I know Paul, we don't know that Paul wrote Hebrews, but the teachings to the Hebrews regarding the matter of the supremacy of Jesus and the replacement of the Mosaic covenant, all of that, along with even some of the things that Paul wrote to the Roman Christians, it's clear that this was a big old hairy question that for a long time troubled a lot of people in the early church. I have always said that you and I, for the most part, do not completely understand what it would have been like to spend your life as a Jew and then be presented with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Somebody says, well, I was raised in a denominational church and I was converted. With all due respect to the significant change that had to take place there, I still believe that to the Jewish practitioners, there was an even greater challenge to completely step away from all that was involved in the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant. The rich heritage that had brought it into existence through the descendants of Abraham, and all of the claims and the significance of being able to say, I'm of the tribe of whatever. I'm afraid we don't appreciate that as much as Stuart, we got one up here. Kathy Johnson has a comment. I'm afraid we don't appreciate the depth of the thing that they had to turn away from in order to come to Christ. Go ahead.
Yes, to that point, for the Jews, that was the covenant. That was the connection. And so, to give them a little grace here, in their thinking, to complete that for the Gentiles, maybe thinking this was a necessary step.
And to the point that Mike made in class Wednesday night, the parable that Jesus taught about the hiring of the workers at the later hour and then everyone getting paid the same, it's very obvious to us that was a tremendous illustration of the principles involved in the Jewish people who had always, quote unquote, followed God in the footsteps of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then now all of a sudden the Gentiles are able to come and have salvation. There's a 3-letter sentence that we are really, really overly ready to turn loose of every time something like this happens. You know what it is? That's not fair. That's not fair. I can imagine a lot of the Jewish people taking that approach and saying, this is not fair. And in fact, remember that discussion that Paul had with the Jews in Rome, where he says, well then, what advantage hath the Jew? In other words, if there is no more division between Jew, what good was it to be a Jew all of these years? And remember, he said, much in every way, the oracles of the law came through you. The relationship with God was illustrated through your history. And he goes on that along that same line. So I say all of that to say that this controversy here in the early church at Jerusalem should not be surprising to us, given all of the attitudes and remember, this is probably we've already identified these folks of the party of the Pharisees. Remember, everything that we studied previously in the Gospels, in the harmony of the Gospels in studying Christ, and we looked at all of the controversy between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We knew that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were politicians as well as religious leaders, but we kind of forgot the politician part because they were so reckless in their opposing Jesus. But the Pharisees, Sadducees, a lot of different groups were divisions of political persuasion, some more liberal, some more conservative, some liberal toward the moral law, some more liberal toward the worship law, some more conservative toward one and more liberal toward the other, just like today. What was that mean? Just like today, you know, there's just so much political division in all different kinds of shades of the differences. Stuart, we got one right up on the front. So remember, not just Jew versus Gentile, but we got to think in this in terms of Jewish Christian who's also a Pharisee politically. There's another bit of complication that I don't think we have the ability to understand. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to
Get that
say,
thing up close to your mouth.
they were Jews. They were born Jews.
Talk into that microphone. It won't bite you, I promise.
They were born Jews.
Right.
Like, like people now say, well, I'm a Baptist, I'm a this. But the Jews were born, when they were born, you are a Jew.
That's right.
It wasn't. So that was more important, I think, than
That's
a
a good point.
conversion.
It was not so much, well, this is a religion of my mama and daddy, and if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. No, it went back many, many generations beyond that. When they were, as Sister Shirley says, when they were born, they were a Jew. And that had all kinds of ramifications. So, I'm not saying we shouldn't recognize the wrong in their position, but I am saying that we probably need a little bit more understanding to how easy it could be to get caught up in some of these misunderstandings on the part of some of the Jews. Go ahead.
Kind of following up with what Sister Shirley is saying, these people were Jews. They were known as the circumcision. And so I think it's to their credit to say that we want to receive the Gentiles, because they said, well, if they're going to be one of us, and that's the way they thought of themselves, as us and them, if they're going to be one of us, then they need to be circumcised. So really it's showing that they're saying, okay, we want to receive them, but this is important. But then when you pull the apostles and the elders together, and since they were following the teachings of the apostles, it was good that they gathered together so that everybody can say, well, if we're following the teachings of the apostles, then let's see where they stand. We'll go to Jerusalem because we know we got people that'll back what we're saying, but it didn't turn out good for them. So I think they're to be commended to say that we want to receive the Gentiles in. This is a condition they need to meet because it's us and them. But the lesson was to the Jews to say, circumcision of the flesh is nothing. Under Christ, it's circumcision of the heart. And so the lesson was really for them, I believe, obviously, that, but I still think they need to be commended for receiving the Gentiles in.
Yeah, and we've got to remember that these people who are advocating the circumcision, this is not the persecuting group that Paul was a part of. These were not people who were out to kill every Christian. They were just saying that there's something else they need to do. Go ahead, Doug.
What happens if a family has children and they're considered Jews and they've been circumcised or what have you, and they didn't want to circumcise their boys? What happened to those boys as far as the Jews were? Were they considered not anymore?
Well, that's a tough question. I'm not sure which direction I need to go, but not really important which direction I go. I'm not sure I even know the answer. Jesus said I have come not to bring peace, but to bring division. Father against mother, son against parent. And I believe in those words that Jesus spoke, there was the prophetic message that serving Christ, serving God through Jesus Christ, was never going to be embraced by everybody, because there would inevitably be those who would be cast out by those who did not want to make the change. Now, I'm not so sure. I really don't know that much about the Jewish history, or it's more than history, but I'm not sure what all would happen in the minds of practicing Jews. I'm not sure what sanctions would be levied against a young Jewish male who had never been circumcised. I'm just not sure. Right. Yeah, it was not a thing. It was not a thing that happened when they were old enough to make decision. It was done while they were babies, seventh day after they were born. So that hypothetical scenario wouldn't really apply. But there were plenty of other ways that a young person could grow up in a Jewish family and reach a point at which he said, I'm not going to continue to embrace this worship, this law that you are following. I'm going to follow Christ. And I think the ramifications would be similar. Stuart, we got another one up front. Again, we live in a really easy culture, don't we? I mean, there's nothing equivalent to this for most of us. Go ahead, Harold.
Well, if we can look at it through the eyes of people in Thailand that convert to the gospel, the person that converts out of that family is disowned and thrown out by that family. They're thrown out of their jobs, everything else, because they're not Buddhist anymore.
Right.
And so that would be an indication to me of how somebody in this situation, when they got older, would be disowned or thrown out by the family.
And that's exactly what I mean when I say we live in a very convenient culture. We don't have an overpowering, for the most part, religion that reaches even into our employment, and says, if you become a Christian, you can't work here anymore. We've spent a long time and a lot of effort making laws to make sure that there is no discrimination on the basis of religious choice. Now, some of that's gone off the rails in some ways and been misused, but we don't really have an equivalent. Stephen, go ahead.
It seems to me that the ones that are saying you have to be circumcised and follow the law, it seems that they were Christians, some that had been converted to be Christians. And what that says to me is they don't really understand what it means to be a Christian, because you put away the old law and you have a new covenant. And I think there was just a misunderstanding on their part. And I think it's interesting that instead of the apostles going back and saying, no, this is the way it is, they actually just went back and taught, and then they helped them come to the right conclusion, and then they went from there.
Okay, good point. Any other comments? Terry.
No, we're not. I know we're not there yet, but in chapter 16, Paul takes Timothy when they get to Derbe and Lystra, and circumcises him, because his mother was a Jew and his father was a Greek, And it says because of the Jews in that area. I was just wondering, was that because he thought it would be easier to or better for preaching the gospel in that area, or what would be the reason for that other than that?
The term that comes to my mind is uncomplicated. It would allow the work to go on without, Aubrey, you're not giving them previews of my sermon up there, are you? Okay. To have Timothy circumcised would eliminate the added complication of the Jewish opposition to him, since his father was a Greek. Now, and of course, somebody's going to always say, well, now, that seems a little bit inconsistent. I suppose that you could see it that way without the benefit of careful study and examination of everything the Scriptures teach, and without giving any kind of consideration to this particular problem that was a real everyday problem for the church in this early time. You cannot deny that there was a transitional period in the practice of the Jews who became Christians, that there were some leftovers, some holdover, some things that they held to in the early days of the church, that it took a while to weed all of that out. Mercifully, our time is gone. Mercifully for me. we will take this up next, not next Sunday. I think Brother Harold Savage is going to speak to us at the Sunday school hour. Am I right about that? Okay. And so this will be, 2 weeks from today, Lord willing, we'll zoom back in on chapter 15, verse 6, which will be the second Sunday in November, whenever that is. Daily Bible readers. Thank you.